If any Native American civilization truly had an impressive impact as a potential powerhouse, the Incas definitely would have been a good candidate. Only these are not the Incas, and this is not the Inca Empire, technically. Artifacts and ruins from this former great power are scattered throughout the constantly historically neglected continent of South America, and it's safe to say that at one point this empire was the most isolated great power in all of history and was divided between its four regional constituents or regions. The inhabitants referred to their empire not as the Inca Empire, but as the Tahuantinsuyo, meaning four regions in Quechua, as Inca is neither a nationality or language, but rather a title given to the nobility or ruling class, and hence Inca Empire was a term coined by the Spaniards upon the discovery of this region. But hey, that's the vernacular we use, so I'll stick to it. But sadly today it would appear that no political, cultural, or genetic legacy of the Incas remain in South America, and they have simply been replaced by a multitude of new Hispanic nations. Or have they? Today, let's discuss some of the history of these so-called Incas, what their lives were like, and how they rose fast and burned bright, but ultimately met an untimely demise. As mentioned previously, unlike the Aztecs or Mayans, who had a centrally unified culture and language, that being Nahuatl and Mayan respectively, the Inca Empire had a plethora of highly heterogeneous cultures scattered throughout its relatively colossal territory, many of whom may appear very similar but are quite distinct when you take the time to learn about them. Because there was no written language in the Americas prior to the 1500s, it's very difficult to determine the ethnogenesis of the various cultures of the empire, but they can generally be easily distinguished from other Amerindians of South America, being known as the Andean civilizations, lying around the Andes mountain range, while the more primitive, isolated tribes to their east are known as Amazonian cultures, obviously lying in the Amazon rainforest. Couple the lack of literacy with the fact that so much information and so many cultures were lost in the Spanish conquest of the Americas, and we may never know the true phylogenetic relationship between the languages of South America, but from what anthropologists can gather, native South Americans descend from a few waves of migration from the north, with the older groups generally carrying haplogroup Q3, while the more recent groups, who have arrived a couple thousand years later, belong to C3. Some have speculated that the C3 haplogroup and many other innovations in the Americas might have actually come from Polynesian sailors from Oceania, but that's a topic for another time. It's strange to think about, but the Inca Empire actually had a relatively recent rise to power, with the Incas originally being a Quechua-speaking tribe located deep in the Andean Mountains in modern-day Peru, in a modest town called Cusco. And no, I'm not talking about that Emperor Cusco. The king of this small city-state known as Inca Roca dreamed of greatly expanding his control from this small mountainous kingdom and succeeded in conquering a few neighboring tribes before he died in 1388 at the age of 103. But it was really his great-grandson, Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, who fulfilled this wish by conquering the northern Andes in the mid-1400s, keeping the administrative center in Cusco, but constructed Machu Picchu as his personal estate, although contrary to popular belief, this was never the capital city. Pachacuti's son, Topa, or Tupac, was responsible for the great expansion south and a little bit further north, creating an empire stretching all the way from modern-day Colombia to Chile, with the eastern cutoff generally being the border between the Andes Mountain and the vast untamed Amazon, which even the Incas thought wasn't worth conquering or exploring, and for nearly half a century the Incas were the greatest uncontested power of the Americas up until the Spaniards came knocking. At its height, the Inca Empire was about 2.2 million square kilometers, about the size of Greenland, or a little larger than modern-day Mexico. But the reason this is so remarkable is the fact that the empire stretched an unimaginably long latitude, and the only pack animals the citizens had were the infamous llamas and alpacas, two closely related species actually more akin to camels than cows or horses. Even though in the modern age, a few countries such as Chile or Vietnam are noteworthy for their geographically elongated shapes, in pre-industrial nations this was quite rare as the logistics of north-south communication became quite the hassle. So the fact that the Incas were able to not only conquer a huge stretch of land from the rough Andes to a huge chunk of the Pacific coast of South America using nothing but glorified mountain camels and crude seafaring vessels is quite impressive. Now you see, by this time Hernan Cortez had just finished conquering the Aztecs a bit north in Mesoamerica, and attracted by potential wealth and fame, his cousin Francisco Pizarro led an expedition south with a couple hundred men and discovered tombs in modern Peru, a northern city of the Inca Empire, and impressed with what he saw, quickly traveled back to Spain in order to obtain permission from the crown to conquer this new land. But unknown to them, their plan was already in motion. The Spaniards who arrived on the northern shores of the Inca Empire had already deployed their deadliest weapon unknowingly to the natives they interacted with, that being disease. Within 2 years, a smallpox epidemic had swept through the Inca Empire, utterly devastating the population, as it's estimated that out of the roughly 10 million pre-epidemic inhabitants, at least 75% died of smallpox, including the Inca Empire, by the way, whose death directly led to an even more disastrous civil war between his two sons, Atahualpa and Huáscar, with the former eventually coming out on top. When Pizarro arrived in the region with his brothers a few years later, they were utterly shocked by the sheer devastation seen throughout the land, being virtually unrecognizable as the once great power that ruled. This allowed the Spaniards to lead a campaign against the greatly weakened husk of an empire with only a few hundred men, although they did attempt to gather other native allies from the surrounding areas in their conquest with various degrees of success. The Incas hence fell quite quickly to the incoming Spaniards due to a variety of factors, including the population being crippled by the smallpox epidemic, the civil war that transpired only months prior, and the fact that many of the Inca elite that opposed Atahualpa actually welcomed the Spaniards and were rewarded after the new government was installed. Tupac Amaru, last emperor of the Inca Empire, or any Native American empire, was defiant until the end, leading the surviving Incas in many revolts against the Spanish rule for decades from the fringes of the Andes until he was captured by Spanish officials and executed in 1572, thus ending the line of great Inca rulers. The main ethnic groups in the empire at the time of its downfall were the Quechua, Aymara, and several much smaller groups, many of whom have gone extinct since the fall of the Inca Empire. So it's very difficult to call any single group the real successors of the Incas, but needless to say, following the incorporation into New Spain, the former Inca territory, which was renamed Peru, would attract many Spaniards who brought African slaves, and the three groups gradually intermixed in the following centuries, creating a new dominant class of mestizos. It's important to realize that many near full-blooded Amerindians or whites living in Latino countries may identify as mestizo due to it being more of a cultural identifier to them rather than a racial one, meaning someone of Quechua or Spanish descent may call themselves mestizos simply because they identify with both European and indigenous aspects of their country's culture. So although in the official Peruvian census of 2017 only 26% of the country identified as indigenous, this number is almost certainly a bit higher, and it's actually been found through genetic studies that unlike the mestizo or mixed race population of Paraguay, in Peru the mestizos are far more likely to have more Amerindian heritage than European, and it was much more common for Hispanicized high-class Quechuas to marry into the mestizo population, giving a more balanced gender distribution than Paraguay, as it wasn't only Spanish men who were marrying indigenous women, with indigenous men marrying outside as well. In the meantime, Peruvians, Bolivians, and Ecuadorians have shaped their own national identities, placing less of an emphasis on racial background, as in the past century and a half, ever since their independence from the Spanish Empire, there have been waves of migrants from southern and eastern Europe, including Italians, Jews, Croats, or Poles, as well as from East Asia, interestingly enough. As I discussed in an older video, Peru has one of the largest populations of Chinese and Japanese ancestry in the world, and it was and is incredibly common for third and fourth generation Asian immigrants to marry into other racial groups of these countries. Hence, you may have someone of mixed Japanese, Aymara, or Chinese, Quechua ancestry carrying the blood of ancient civilizations from both sides of the Pacific. If you were to liquidate the population of Peru and separate the DNA of its citizens into their component races, the genome would be nearly two-thirds Amerindian, a stark contrast to most other former Spanish colonies such as Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, Costa Rica, or Paraguay, which all have a majority European genome, and the same can be said for Bolivia, especially Bolivia, which due to its isolated nature has a far higher degree of Amerindian admixture. This makes Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia some of the only countries in the America where a majority of the national genome is of Amerindian origin, meaning that a majority of their population has some degree of ancestry from the previous empire of the Incas, although, as I discussed, all citizens of the empire did not refer to themselves as Incas, as this was a term reserved only for the ruling class. In fact, many Latin American leaders following independence from the Spanish claimed partial descent directly from the Inca monarchs, with various degrees of truth in these claims. Today, over 60 million people live in territory that was formerly a part of the Tawantinsuyu, and although it's near impossible to tell how many of these inhabitants are descendants of the true Incas, it's certain that the majority of the 60 million has some degree of ancestry from the former citizens of the empire, even though the chances of any Neo-Inca Empire rising from the ashes is virtually zero. Although the Incas themselves are long gone and never coming back, their influence can still be felt across South America and the Hispanic world, as Inti, the son of May god, prevalent throughout the polytheistic practices of the Incas, is actually on the flags of both Argentina and Uruguay, curiously enough, the latter of the two having pretty much no connection with the Incas. But this just goes to show how much of an impact the Incas had, even if their reign burned bright and fast. Please tell me your thoughts on the Inca Empire in the comments and their modern descendants in Latin America. And for today's poll, answer what you think happened to the last of the Incas. And as always, this has been Mason. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.